Hello, my name is Lara Nichols and I'm a curator of art at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra on Ngunnawal Ngambri country. Today I'm going to talk to you about Nora Heysen, who was Australia's first woman official war artist. She served in the Second World War and went to places such as New Guinea and North Queensland, documenting the work of the Australian Women's Services. The first thing that struck me about Nora Heysen was that in her day, in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, she was really a household name. She was a very well-known Australian woman artist, and that was, often because of the fact that her father was very famous Hans Heysen, but also because her work was widely collected by institutions. She was the first woman to win the Archibald Prize, for example, and as we know, she was the first Australian woman artist to be appointed as an official war artist. But really we know very little about her war work. And I was really amazed when I started to look more deeply into this, just how many works she made as an official war artist for the War Memorial. The group of works that she produced is not only an incredible scale, it's also of a remarkable quality, covering a diverse range of subjects, which gives us such an incredible insight in the services in New Guinea. The 20th century Australian artist Nora Heysen is often framed as the archetypal woman artist, whose life and work has been recovered from apparent obscurity thanks to recent feminist interventions in art history. But her profile during her lifetime was actually quite different. In fact, when Heysen was appointed an official war artist in 1943, she was already a household name, a famous artist and influential figure of the Australian art world. In 1933, at the age of 22, Heysen held her first solo exhibition. The Art Gallery of New South Wales had already acquired 2 of her still life paintings, and both the Art Gallery of South Australia and the Queensland Art Gallery owned her work. In 1938, she made headlines when she became the first woman artist to win the prestigious Archibald Prize with her painting of Madame Elinke Schuurman, who was the French wife of the Dutch Consul General to Australia. I would like to consider Nora Heysen through her achievement as the first Australian woman appointed as an official war artist. To do this, we'll look at some of the 62 oil paintings and 190 works on paper that Heysen made for the memorial as part of her commission as a war artist in the Second World War. It is the largest collection of work by the artist in the world. Made over the course of her 2-year commission, it reveals her extraordinary talent and prodigious work ethic. While we look at this remarkable body of work, I would like us to think about the subject of women's labour during wartime and their status within the armed forces. We have learnt much about Nora Heysen through the work of several scholars. Firstly, Professor Kathy Speck has published the delightfully candid letters between Nora and her father, the famous landscape painter Hans Heysen. Speck has also written 2 definitive texts on women war artists. And more recently, Anne Louise Willoughby wrote a fascinating biography of Nora. And of course, the Australian War Memorial has considerable archival material about her commission. Before we begin, let's quickly talk about the official war art scheme itself. The Australian official war art scheme was instigated in the First World War. 18 artists were commissioned, all of whom were men residing in the UK when appointed. The scheme was continued in the Second World War, in which 43 Australian male artists and 3 women were appointed. It was manned by Lieutenant Colonel John Treloar, who was the director of the Australian War Memorial when the Second World War broke out. Treloar stepped down from his role during the war and became the head of the military history unit located at the Victoria Barracks in Melbourne. From here, he ran the war art scheme. Alongside the civilian artists who were appointed, those who were already serving in the Defence Force were also selected to work as artists attached to the military history section. At this time, civilian artists such as Nora, who were appointed to the official scheme, were given the honorific title such as Captain. You may be interested to know that the scheme still runs today, and recently the memorial appointed Stanislava Pinchuk to document the Australian Defence Force training of Ukrainian soldiers in Britain. Looking at the subject of women's labour during the Second World War through Nora's work, I'd like to consider 2 things. First is the idea of artistic labour. That is the way that Nora's experience as a professional woman artist changed with her commission. Prior to her commission, Nora's practice was studio-based within the British Australian art world, but suddenly with her appointment, she's working outdoors in close proximity to the New Guinea battlefield. She's also working within an entirely other superstructure, that of Australia's military. Second, I'm looking at the subject of women's labour within the military, and this means Nora's depiction of women working in the field within the context of a fully industrialised military. Both aspects show an extraordinary transformation in the working life of Australian women in the Second World War. Let's now consider Nora the artist. Heysen followed a common historical pattern among professional women artists born into artist families. In her case, her father Hans Heysen was a central figure in her life and fully supported her training both at home and abroad. In 1934, Nora travelled to England with her parents to study art, a pilgrimage that many Australian women artists had made before her. She enrolled at the Central School and Byam Shaw School. In London, she made friends with French Impressionist painters of the Pissarro family dynasty. Lucien Pissarro even loaned her 3 works for her studio, one of his own, one of his famous father Camille Pissarro, and one by his daughter Orovida. As an expression of Nora's clout in the Australian art world, she lobbied her father to acquire the Pissarro works for the Art Gallery of South Australia. The director of the Art Gallery of South Australia and advisor to the Australian War Memorial, Louis McCubbin, agreed to buy the landscape by Lucien Pissarro, which is now in their collection. McCubbin went on to recommend Nora Heysen to the Australian War Memorial for her appointment as an official war artist. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Nora was largely painting floral still life and portraits. For example, in Petunias, we see an oriental green porcelain vase filled with a profusion of mauve, pink and white petunias. The table is aesthetically laid with Chinese silks and the background is hung with a rich blue silk fabric with gold embroidery. 3 perfect apples sit in the foreground. The work is rather typical of Heysen's formal pre-war still life painting. After her appointment as a war artist, we suddenly see subjects of women as workers in pressing and risky situations. Gone is the finesse and finish of the studio still life or figuration captured in aspect. Instead, we see women hard at work. Nora began her commission in Melbourne. The press was so interested in Nora's appointment that they ran the article months before the official announcement, which caused considerable consternation at Army HQ. Finally, on the 18th of October 1943, Nora was officially appointed for the purposes of documenting the women's services in Australia. The male artists were engaged to depict military operations in conflict zones overseas, and women were engaged to document the work of women on the home front. In the case of Stella Bowen, she was assigned to cover the Royal Australian Air Force and later the repatriation of Allied prisoners of war in England. Already we can see the influence on gender on the types of work women were assigned. There was also another unfortunate legacy of being born a woman, and that was the administration of Nora's salary. The reason why there was considerable delay between McCubbin's recommendation of Heysen and her appointment was because of the wrangling over her rate of pay. When the Minister of the Interior approved her appointment, he made it very clear that Nora was to be paid the same rate as male artists. Although the memorial oversaw the scheme, the artists were actually paid by the Army, and the Army decided it did not agree with the Minister's decision because it was not consistent with the lower rates of pay women received in the Australian Women's Army Service, to whom Nora reported. The Army refused to pay her above the women's rate of pay, and in the end the memorial paid the shortfall and Nora did receive the same rate of pay as her male counterparts, which was 42 shillings per day or £2.02 per day. In Melbourne, she resided at the now demolished Menzies Hotel and had a studio in the former city morgue, which was in fact still operational. Her first job was to paint the portraits of the leaders of the women's services. And so her first paintings were a group of 7 formal studio portraits of the leaders of each service. The first was a portrait of Colonel Sybil Howie Irving, controller of the Australian Women's Army Service. She made 2 portraits as she wrestled with the fabric of the uniform and the formal pose and setting of the sitter. This was followed by portraits of other women leaders, such as the portrait of First Officer Sheila McClemens from the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service, and then later a portrait of Group Officer Claire Stevenson from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. In these portraits, we see a dramatic change in the presentation of womanhood. In the portrait of the Consul's wife, which won the Archibald in 1938, the sitter is draped in magnificent embroidered silks, her beauty emphasised with a soft hairstyle and full makeup. But now we see the stiff wool gabardine uniforms, the starched hats, the practical, wise faces of the service women. The only colour in the composition was to be found on their stripes and pips. The uniform, in fact, becomes like an armour, a masculinised dress code readily absorbed into military culture. Indeed, Nora struggled with the colour khaki, which she wrote to her father about. She says, "I have been immersed in my khaki scheme, and as if, having once mixed the colours, I couldn't get enough of it, I was tackling the whole thing in that tone, with the only relief the red stripes on the lapels and ribbons on the chest." Nora struck up a rapport with one sitter in particular, matron Annie Sage, who recommended she accompany her nurses to the casualty clearing station in Finschhaven in New Guinea to depict the risky work women were carrying out each day close to the New Guinea battlefields. Captain Treloar had to first approve the variation to her commission, which he did on matron Sage's recommendation. On the 15th of March 1944, Heysen was posted to the military history section for duty as a war artist with approval to go to New Guinea. Her artist materials weighed over 10 pounds and needed to be sent separately. Thus begins an unsteady start where she is often at loggerheads with military procedure and expectation. The clearing station at Finschhaven was the locale of one of the most devastating battles of the New Guinea offensive. When Heysen arrived, it was both impenetrable jungle and a ruined battleground, replete with ordnances and at times bodies, as she discovered on one painting excursion. Nora arrived in Finschhaven in April 1944 and lived in barracks with the nurses at the casualty clearing station. The women had already served in the Middle East, France and Greece and had little time for newly minted captain who had not seen a day's battle and was being paid more than them. There is a sketchiness to these small early paintings and a sense of her trying to find her subject. She looked at everything around her and was seemingly overloaded by the content in terms of both subject and quantity. I think she was first and foremost an artist who looked at everything with an artist's eye. And she was also a woman of the world. She'd travelled, she understood the world, she was fascinated by the world. She wasn't just going to go to New Guinea and paint Anglo-Australian soldiers in the jungle. She was going to see everything, and she was going to paint what she saw and give just weight to everything. And I think there's quite a strong group of drawings in particular where she paints villagers sewing mats, for example, for the sisters' mess, villagers building the structures for the sisters to work and live in, and then, of course, the Papuan infantry battalions who were so critical to the success of the Allied forces in New Guinea. And I don't think there was any way she would ever have gone there and not painted those men. She was stationed in the hospital, so her opportunity to paint them was when they were recovering or when they were injured and sick. And these men were very brave Papuan warriors who were protecting their land. So yes, they were working for the Allied army in support of the Allied forces, but they were there to protect their land, their First Nations land, from the invasion of an outside force. Two portraits in particular stand out of the Papuan servicemen who worked together at a critical stage of the offensive in New Guinea. One is of Sergeant Tapiole, here seen drawn by Nora Heysen in Alekshafen when he was recuperating in August 1944. The other was Sergeant Mepti, and his portrait is equally arresting. These two men were asked to just do a reconnaissance mission to check postings of Japanese platoons. And of course they knew the jungle really well and were very quickly able to find where these sites were. And they couldn't just take notes and take them back to command. They saw the opportunity and demobilised those platoons, and therefore saved further onslaught to their own people and to the Allied forces. They were very brave positions that they took. They were definitely against commanding orders, but they were on their land and they were going to do what they felt they needed to do to protect it. And I find that bravery really comes through in these very proud, dignified portraits that Nora was able to draw. And she would have drawn them so quickly. And you can sort of see her, in one of them you can see her working out the colours and the pastels and things in the side of the drawing. She's just sat there and she's seen them, and she has drawn these magnificent works which, to my mind, when I first saw them, reminded me of Renaissance drawings. They have all the skill of the classically trained artist, which she was, but with that bravura touch of just being able to do a few lines here and there, and this magical image comes forth of a real person who we could imagine we could actually speak to when we look at the picture in the gallery. Nora also drew some of the young children in Alekshaven and Finchhaven, and this was perhaps one of the most beautiful drawings from this campaign that's in our collection. It's a portrait of a young boy by the name of Nazi. She's signed it here. She's drawn the work at Finchhaven on the 5th of May 1944. This work is very much an example of classical portraiture and really does show her academic training at work, and even just using a sanguine pastel crayon is quite a Renaissance technique. So it really does show the depth of her training at work as much as it being a beautiful on-the-spot drawing. In this particular drawing we see Papuan people building the sisters' mess in lei. It's an absolutely beautiful figure composition, so skillfully drawn, that also shows her classical training hard at work with these complicated figure groups in the midst of their work. It also gives you an idea of the sorts of buildings, in fact, that the nursing corps were working in New Guinea at the time. This work's really interesting because it shows a member of the Papuan police service as well. And this particular man, Ango, he was awarded the Loyal Service Medal. The other thing I really like about it is it shows her work in progress in many ways. I mean, it is a finished drawing because she signed it, but it shows a sort of quick sketchiness and her bravura work with the sanguine pastel as she captures this really striking likeness of the policeman. And the other thing in the corner, we can see her sort of experimenting on the spot with her media. So there's a bit of red chalk and a bit of the black charcoal as well, and she's sort of working it out as she's sitting there in front of him. Nora sent her first group of works back to Treloar, who was underwhelmed, writing to her on the 15th of July 1944, "Now that we've received a number of your pictures from New Guinea, I think I should offer for your consideration the following comments from the standpoint of coverage. The work of the Australian Army Medical Service is practically uncovered. In the pictures we have received, there are only 3 which deal with this subject. 2 are social, one shows a dance and the other a tea party. In any case, I think it will be necessary to arrange for you to return in the near future to the mainland. Lieutenant Colonel John Treloar." Here we can see some of the so-called incidental scenes Treloar was underwhelmed by. In particular, the view from the sisters' mess in Finchhaven, painted when Nora first arrived in April 44. Dance in the sisters' mess, or the delicate scene of 2 young girls, Mete and Arbulu, sewing carpet for the sisters' mess in the General Hospital in Ley. Nora was feisty and knew how to stand up for herself. She responded to Treloar's letter and contradicted him, not at all concerned about Treloar's higher rank. She writes, "Firstly, that as there are no Australian Women's Medical Service personnel in New Guinea, I have been unable to represent them. It is true that up to date I have done little to portray the wartime activities of the Australian Nurses Service and have dealt with the more practical side of their life. It is my belief that these social functions given by the sisters to entertain the men are an important diversion and help the morale of the men. Its aspect is, I suppose, more frivolous, but it is surely a part of the passion worth recording. I think it is hardly justified to judge the output of 2.5 months' work as conclusive proof that I'm incapable of covering the work expected of me here. I think also that for one woman to attempt to portray the activities of all the branches of the women's services is an impossibility, and that is rather unfair to expect it of me. Contrary to Treloar's misgivings, Nora was making a large and impressive body of work, and she was capturing many medical operations and general nursing at the clearing station. Some of the scenes show the women working peacefully, such as the painting Sister Minnie Goldstein working in the blood bank at Alexshafen in 1944, and another work, Theatre Sister Margaret Sullivan. But others remind us of the horror of war. In one scene she painted twice, we see a New Guinean soldier badly injured, having lost both hands when a bomb detonated, and the nurse is seen tending to his bandages. During this period, Nora contracted debilitating dermatitis and took medical leave, returning to Australia and a new studio in Melbourne. Here she learns that the dermatitis is in fact the result of her taking the Atterbury drill to prevent malaria. The labour of being a war artist had taken its toll on her body, and yet she still produced a large and significant group of works. In May 1945, Nora handed over 86 works in oil and watercolour to Treloar, who replied to her, "I myself would like to see your engagement extended indefinitely so that you can do with the Women's Royal Naval Service and the Women's Auxiliary Air Force similar to which you have done with the Army Women's Service." There is also another surprising narrative in Nora Heysen's experience in New Guinea, which is connected to a significant problem facing the Australian troops who were stationed there. The biggest threat to the lives of soldiers in New Guinea was the ever-present risk of contracting malaria. The armed forces responded by commissioning tropical medicine specialists in New Guinea and in establishing a research centre in Cairns in North Queensland. While Nora was in Finschhafen, she met the tropical medicine specialist Dr. Robert Black, who was researching the prevention and treatment of the disease. They both fell in love and continued their relationship by letter. Deeply personal and at times passionate, the letters speak of a great love between the artist and the doctor. In one letter, Captain Black writes to Nora, I wish, I'm at the wishing well again, where two shy people found one another, a magic well in a fairy's garden. I wish to tell you in every way that I can that I love you. I do." They were often separated through Nora's commission, but they met again after she was recovering from severe dermatitis in Melbourne. Feeling better, Nora angled to document work at the blood serum preparation unit at the Sydney Hospital, where Black was briefly stationed. In her painting, Pathologist Titrating Sera, which is a portrait of Captain Black, we can see Black at work in his Sydney laboratory. Nora was productive during her short time in Sydney, and the memorial now holds at least 5 fascinating paintings in ethereal greys and whites, plus a group of drawings depicting the medical staff carrying out their work in the quiet surrounds of the Homefront Hospital. Washing Bottles, which is a portrait of Private Doreen Lawrence, is one example of women at work in the Sydney facility. And the depiction of Private Gwyneth Patterson is a classical portrait and shows a dignified likeness of the young nurse in her uniform. These unique works show a side of the war effort which is rarely considered. Heysen and Black were later reunited in Cairns when the artist was sent to cover the Land Headquarters medical research in July 1945. But there was an obstacle to their love. Robert Black had married Dorothy Tandy in 1941, and the couple had a son born just before Black had met Nora. After the war, the couple lived out of wedlock while Black negotiated and awaited his divorce. It was not an ideal situation in an era which frowned upon unmarried women living with their partners, and Nora's parents were also uneasy about it. Eventually, Heysen and Black married at a registry office in Sydney in 1953. But returning to her war commission, with her appointment extended, Nora was initially assigned to work at the Land Headquarters Medical Research Unit in Cairns, where entomologists were undertaking groundbreaking medical research into malaria, which had caused more casualties than battle. However, she was unexpectedly diverted to the AIF Medical Air Evacuation Unit at the RAF base in Townsville. This unit was responsible for airlifting injured and missing soldiers from Morotai and Lae. It is in this group of works which we can see fully the risk servicewomen faced every day. The three works I'm going to look at are firstly Ambulance Plane Carrying Casualties from Morotai to Townsville, painted in 1945, followed by the two portraits drawn in charcoal and crayon, one of Sister Marie Craig and the other of Sister Shea. The nurses in this unit carried out in-flight medical care, as we can see in the painting of the ambulance plane. They were also trained in emergency jungle and ocean survival procedures and were trained to use weapons. The trips would take up to 8 hours, and Nora attended a number of such recovery flights. While the nurses were called ministering angels, they were in fact fully militarised. Death in the workplace was not uncommon, as two drawings attest. The portrait of Sister Marie Craig in sepia Conte crayon and charcoal was drawn 1 month before her plane went down in September 1945. The wreckage was not located until 25 years later, when it was discovered on the side of a mountain in the Cartens Ranges. In her memoir held at the memorial, Flying Sister Beryl Chandler described the conversation between Marie and Nora when the artist was seeking volunteers to paint. Marie said, "Look, Nora, you might as well paint me. I'll pose for you. This job is going to kill me anyway, and at least people will know what Marie Craig looked like. The writing is on the wall. I'm just not going to make it through." This conversation reminds us that these women risk their lives every day and that their potential death was a constant background hum as they went about their risky duties. Nora also painted Sister Verdun Chick Chia, who was only 29 years old when she was killed when the transport plane she was aboard crashed during a short flight between Jackanotte Bay and Rabaul. Beryl Chandler explained that Chick was given her nickname because no matter what the conditions, she was always immaculate. Even after a long 8-hour flight tending to the wounded, she would alight from the plane looking like a movie star. And I think that the portrait really shows that. After this stint at the airlift service, Nora is then sent back to Cairns to paint scenes at the Land Headquarters Medical Research Unit. It is here that she paints some of her most iconic war works, including Sponging a Malaria Patient, the portrait of the Royal Air Force cook Corporal Joan Whipp, and the transport driver aircraft woman Florence Miles in 1945. Nora made an interesting group of paintings which depicted the experiments taken out on Defence Force personnel to test new anti-malaria drugs. Some of these works show the scientists at work in their laboratory growing mosquito larvae, as in this particular work, Mosquito Colony, which is a portrait of Lieutenant Thomas Lemerle. Others show the men suffering the effects of malaria. Nora wrote to Treloar about this work, describing the men as patients who suffer as guinea pigs, infected with malaria for the progress of science. These volunteers do a good job, I think, and deserve recording. One such volunteer, Ken Glover, wrote to the memorial in 1990 after seeing a painting by Nora in the galleries in which she depicted him in the fever stage of malaria, being sponged down by Private Hazel Luge. He writes, "I volunteered to become a human guinea pig and became part of a group of 10 on which a new drug was to be tried. The doctors thought they now had the best drug and they wanted 10 very fit soldiers to test it out properly. They were infected with BT and MT types of malaria and given a daily dose of Palaquin, and we soon found out why we had to be so fit. The trial patients were sent on long training marches of up to 150 miles with full kit in the height of summer, from Jungara to Mossman and back to Port Douglas and back. During the marches, they were not allowed to sleep and were given only 10 minutes rest each hour. They then spent 2 to 3 hours locked up in the Cairns Meatworks freezer without clothing and were not allowed out at night. The object was to break down the drug in the body and then let the malaria attack the patient. But the drug was too good, and none of the test patients contracted malaria until the drug was discontinued. And then the men had very severe attacks. During the attacks, they were not given any treatment. Ken had 10 attacks in 7 days. He wrote, "I was near death, and that is when the painting was made. And we were given a special course of Palaquin, which revived us, and after building up our weight, we were sent home for discharge. Two of Nora's most memorable works, which has come to embody feminist ideals of strong female labour and leadership, are her portraits of aircraft woman Florence Miles and the Women Auxiliary Australian Air Force cook, Corporal Joan Whipp, both painted in 1945 in Cairns. Nora fills the picture plane with the figure of Joan Whipp, her arms folded across her stomach to emphasise their strength and signal her capability. Her white Air Force shirt and apron is unisex and completely defeminised. Joan is a figure of grace and good humour under pressure, and is also a portrait unlike any of the many posed official military portraits of generals and majors in full dress kit, which populate the memorial's collection. Joan's important contribution in feeding the forces would have been left unrecognised and unremembered had Nora not been appointed and not chosen to create a fully finished portrait of the cook who kept the malaria unit sustained. Finally, no discussion of Nora's work from the Second World War would be complete without the beloved transport driver aircraft woman Florence Miles, painted in 1945 in Cairns. The painting has assumed a status well beyond the war and has come to symbolise so much about the strength and resilience and versatility of women. It also shows that work is not gendered. The painting not only symbolises women's swift and effective transfer into traditionally masculine roles, but that these roles can be quite naturally women's roles. Florence Miles is a feminine force in the cabin of her bus, a space that she owns. Heysen paints Miles with her lipstick on, her blonde hair fashionably curled up under her cap, and her gaze intensely focused on the job at hand. According to Heysen, she selected Florence Miles as the subject for this painting because she saw her as, and I quote, a young forward lass. Miles enlisted in the Women's Air Force Auxiliary Service in 1942, aged 21. Prior to the outbreak of the war, she had worked as a sales assistant for a shoe company in Melbourne. She held a driver's licence and had gained considerable experience driving a variety of vehicles. And once she enlisted, she was sent to the engineering school and served at the No. 25 Operational Base Unit in Queensland. Given her experience with vehicles, she became a driver during the war. Nora's goal here is to show Florence as a figure of great strength in complete command of her army vehicle, comfortable in her role, driving through the rugged terrain outside of Cairns. Would we have known about Florence Miles without Nora, or would we have known much about women's work in any aspect of the New Guinea offensive in the Second World War without Nora's remarkable body of 62 paintings and 190 works on paper? I've chosen to end my story of Nora Heysen as an official war artist with her portrait of the entomologist and parasitologist Major Josephine Macris, alongside one of Nora's own later self-portraits. The reason I've done this is because I perceive a similar serious resolve in these two women, who were both leaders in their own male-dominated fields. Major Macris's contribution to malaria research in the Second World War was paramount in the treatment of malaria, and her legacy continues in this field. Likewise, Nora's work has had a significant impact on the way we have reframed art history and the narratives of women artists and their work. In summary, Nora Heysen worked in considerably difficult conditions. Her first wartime studio was above a morgue. When she painted in the field in New Guinea, one day she discovered that she'd set up her kit on the body of a dead soldier. She drew the portraits of hard-working women who would die in service, and she herself was tested. She suffered terrible bouts of dermatitis. She had to wrangle for a fair pay deal. Despite the trying conditions, her work was critiqued in ways she had not experienced before. But in the end, the Board of Management of the memorial wrote to her expressing its thanks for, and I quote, the fine work you have done as an official war artist. Her work was in the end considered to be an important addition to the War Memorial collection and a worthy record of the work of women's services.